Welcome everyone, and welcome to Future Leadership. We're kind of changing our name to Breaking Status Quo Thinking. And today's topic is fairly broad. It's on trauma. So we're going to discuss and explore how trauma affects us as generations, and including the psyche of the national state collective, and how it impacts behavioral patterns. And eventually we'll talk about how do we become more aware of this to override and work on our generational wounding, and if possible, how to reverse the effects to optimize our full potential as human beings. And today we have with us Timothy Maurice, and he is a brain and brand author and podcaster. He's an expert consultant on influence, behavioral design, leadership. And we also have, for the first time with us, Sonia. She's a metaphysical life coach who teaches self-awareness and life skills through self-development and the power of toolkits and insight support. So we won't really talk about epigenetics, but let's first try and understand by bringing examples how generations are affected by mass trauma, including the apartheid in South Africa or the Rwandan crisis, and how that affects children of the people who are victims of such trauma.
I'll use three examples to kick this off. One is the Dutch community in World War II, where the Germans, as a particular strategy, decided to starve them. And they studied the offsprings and the great-grandchildren, great-grandchildren of these Dutch community, and found that that extreme stress response had altered that DNA and predisposed them to a lot of challenges with health in terms of weight and so forth. Then there was the Jewish community. They studied this group of Jews who were orphaned and were not aware that their grandparents had gone through the Holocaust, and they were experiencing post-Holocaust trauma symptoms. So they had no exposure to the specific pattern. And then I'll use my own sort of community in America. Black Americans, being exposed to the slave trade. When you go back and you look at the extreme stress that happened underneath the ships, a lot of us, due to that extreme salt exposure, had sort of altered our DNA expresses itself. The metallization in our metal groups, which is basically a process of sort of how our genes get turned on and off, was affected. So large groups of people can be impacted by, an economic sort of exposure, some sort of environmental stress to a particular group. And you can imagine how that plays out in South Africa. So the thing I enjoy about this actual conversation is that you realize that our decisions can fundamentally impact the next generation, and as a collective, and our ability to make changes in our own life, in our own family, in our own home, can have the butterfly effect and influence many generations to come.
One of the most incredible things about human beings is how adaptable we are. Okay, you can throw anything at us, and within a very short amount of time, we will adapt to it, and it will become almost normal. And we look at COVID right now as a prime example. All of our lives have drastically changed, and what felt so unfamiliar and awkward and difficult and challenging is now kind of par for the course. We go out, we put our masks on, we have all these restrictions. So we're witnessing how very quickly we adapt. So on a physical, emotional, spiritual, mental level, that same adaptation process is happening. And that can either be positive or negative. So in the case of stress and trauma, we as humans adapt to it so quickly as a coping mechanism, because if we don't, it's a threat to our survival, right? So any person or collective that is put under extreme stress, like the examples that Tim gave, and then also within their personal lives, we began this talk about, as a broad topic, about toxic parents and being raised in a really unhealthy environment as a child. By necessity, in order to survive, you had to adapt. You had to adapt emotionally, mentally, spiritually. All of those things had to happen. The problem is that we don't revert back. We don't revert back to the pure, if you want to call it that, state that we should be in. And so we adapt and we make all of these changes within ourselves. And those changes, I'm so glad Tim started with that, happen on a cellular level. So they've done research on brain patterning between, kids coming from an abusive home to more healthier children, and the actual synapses, their actual brain patterns are completely different. So we start to get an idea of the challenges that we face and the impact that it has on us as an individual. And of course, the individual is always part of the greater society. You have the individual, and then the family, and then, the culture, the religion, and all of these things. So we are not in any way separate to each other. And if we can go back towards the beginning of history, if we want to look at stress and trauma and the effect on it and how it has changed us, there has been positive outcomes because it has driven our technology, our desire to discover more and to create better. So there has been a positive impact on that, right? We wouldn't have our medicine, our quest to understand more, right? It has definitely played a part as a motivator. But the effects on it as an individual are far-reaching, and many people don't understand that they are operating from a very altered state of being. And then it becomes a self-perpetuating cycle. So they have these coping mechanisms in place, not only from their own experiences, but exactly like Tim said, from the generational stuff that's come before them that they are still carrying in their very genes, okay? Now, when I say it becomes self-perpetuating, because now they've got all these limitations, right? Their self-worth is very low. They don't have as much emotional resilience as, perhaps they should. So there's all these little markers that aren't functioning optimally, all right? Because they've been altered and adapted from their stress responses. And then what happens is they see their life and they go, well, I'm not as successful as somebody else. I'm failing in my relationships, in my work. So then they look at their reality and they go, well, it must be true. I must be these things. So instead of recognizing, and I hate to use the word disease because it's not a disease. So instead of recognizing that there was a break in their development, and I'm not only talking individually, so culturally, etc. Instead of recognizing that there was a break in their development and addressing that and healing that, they then think, well, that must be me.
I think from my own experience, so I grew up in kind of a toxic family, and my mom was always not very confident about herself. And so I carried that actually. And I kept thinking all during my 20s, like, where did this come from? So I didn't really, I think I only became aware in my early 30s where I realized that I actually picked it up from my mom. And so I think we spend a lot of time not recognizing.
The difficulty, and it's kind of like the difference between soft and hard abuse. That what you described as a soft abuse, you have hard abuse. You have full on physical, sexual, really traumatic stuff. That is easily recognizable because we know society tells us that is not right.
Oh, the hard abuse.
The hard stuff, yes.
Is easily recognized.
Yes, but it's the softer stuff that's more difficult to pick up because it's
true.
You have the parent who prefers to put all the responsibility on their child. They've never hit them. They've never abused them. They've never done anything like that. But they weren't healthy. And so that's actually almost more difficult to self-diagnose and to recognize that that is part of the patterning that you adapted to.
I would almost say that our biggest challenge as an individual as well as a collective is that most of the markers in the methylation, which is basically a big word for the fact that the instructions and how our genes want to express themselves, they can be switched on or off. And the marker, what it does is alter the switching on or off. Like one of the most popular genes is, the gene that suppresses sort of cancer and tumors and so forth. And so if you go through an extreme environmental condition, some level of stress in the home, there was a divorce when you were a kid, there was a lot of fighting, there was alcohol abuse, or in the case of my mom, where she lost her brother to a car accident at a very young age, there's no way for her to know that there was going to be some marker on her genes. There's just no way. First of all, no one talks about it. There's no one who sits you down and go, okay, you just lost a brother. So what's happening to your genes is this, which is going to position you so that when you experience a number of things, this is how your your genome is going to respond. No one talks about this. So I agree with your framing, Sonia, that there's the sort of conscious stuff that we are aware of that we can actually write down. And then there's all this unconscious stuff that you're exposed to. These sort of subtle traumas, that just sort of like, they press on you subtly. Like you said, it's a soft, they just kind of, they're there. There are microaggressions on a daily, weekly basis. And then over time, you become this sort of person. At the end of our DNA sort of strands are telomeres. And the role of telomeres is to regulate cortisol. And cortisol is this sort of stress chemical that it plays an important role, because if it's not regulated and it just sort of flowing through you all the time, then you're at this sort of hyper-neurotic state. And so what we find, and this is really, really important, is that people who have experienced really early sort of childhood traumas and stresses, the telomeres are not functioning properly. And you find yourself, with all sorts of extraordinary manifestations of behavior that you're not aware of. You don't have no idea where they're coming from. And so when as we start to move towards what are the solutions, what are some of the things that we can do, what are some things that we should be thinking about, it's important to be humble and aware that you may have no clue what your grandparent has passed on to you, or what you experienced when you were a kid were you not even aware of. So let's just assume that everyone listening, in fact, there's a 10-point scale, what they call sort of trauma points. And apparently out of these 10 questions, particularly in America, and I know here, the average person has between 2 and 4 of these points, which is some level of exposure to parental fighting, to divorce, to illness, to mental illness, to all of these things, these sort of abnormalities in the home. And so if we can just sort of assume that you are up to 4, then you are predisposed to experiencing high levels. You probably have reduced telomeres, you have excessive level of cortisol flowing through you, and you need to be positioned to taking proactive account of mindfulness. You need to be very, conscious of your diet. You need to be, you need to engineer a lifestyle that really does address proactively the fact that your entire sort of genome is a bit sort of altered by these markers and these moments in your background.
So many people, when they try and heal, when they try and shift, when they try and grow, they stay at the mental level. And there is only one way to heal ourselves, and that is holistically. And that includes, in fact, it has to be at a physical level. Because we experience life through our physicality, and our chemicals, our DNA, our genes, all of these factors are the operating system in which we live. If that operating system is malfunctioning, right, because of trauma, stress, etc., no matter what you do, no matter how much meditation you do, no matter how many times you go to psychologists, whatever the case may be, it's not going to shift. And for just to give another spin on the genes and those markers that Tim was talking about switching them on and off, we can look at that as nature versus nurture. So we all have our DNA is our DNA, but how the experiences that we go through will determine how we are going to respond. And some people are more resilient than others, all right? There's a whole bunch of stuff around that. And then carrying on about the telomeres, so that heightened response, you guys can, you will recognize that as the flight or fight thing. We all know about that. The problem is under prolonged and unrecognized and unhealed stress and trauma, that flight or fight response doesn't get switched off. So we are always anxious, looking for a fight, and then how we respond will depend on the personality and the type of trauma. But we are always, the physical body is always on the lookout for the next trigger, for the next threat that reflects back the original trauma that we went through, right? Because it was programmed to deal with that threat that you had to go through. But now it's been 10, 20, 30 years later, and that threat assessment thing is still going on. Okay, and it has to be switched off. It has to be switched off. And I'd like to share one of my personal experiences. So I went in my early 20s, I realized I'd gotten to a stage where I also had a very difficult upbringing. And I realized it's make or break time. I have to do something. And I read every book, and I went to psychologists, and I did every single process, and I beat drums, and I beat teddy bears, and I did everything, right? But it wasn't shifting. And I realized why. And because I hadn't taken that healing consciousness journey and choice to heal into the physical level. Because on the physical level, it's where it's all happening. And that's driving your thoughts, it's driving your emotions, it's driving your actions, your behaviors, your everything. And the reason and it's such a beautiful paradox, because the trauma is being held in our cells, it's being held on our physical body.
Like memory.
100%. And the only way to heal it is to go back into it and re-heal it. But that's what we avoid doing, because it's really uncomfortable. It hurts, because that's where all the pain sits. That's where all the trauma sits. And so people avoid doing that. And now we look at the coping mechanisms, we look at the addictions, and I'm just going to put my blinkers on, or just not even admit to there being anything wrong. But I discovered something called TRE, which is trauma release exercise. And it is the most simplest thing. You literally just allow your body to shake out the trauma that has been holding on to. And what it does is it realigns and recalibrates your nervous system. So exactly what Tim was saying about the telomeres, we have to retrain our body to switch off that flight or fight response. And that's what it does. So there's a whole bunch of science behind it. I'm sure I'll send you guys some links, and you must definitely read up about it. But just in a brief overview, as I said, it recalibrates your nervous system so that your nervous system learns to respond to the now and not to what you went through 10, 20, 30, 40 years ago. And what that does is those triggers, okay, because we all get triggered by certain things, right? We will get triggered by the fear of rejection, of failure, of whatever it may be, past memories, whatever it could be, grief, as Tim, you were saying about your mom's case, that grief. So we all have these different triggers. And what the TRE does is it allows your body to, not be triggered by it, because it's that little like marker of, hang on, this is danger, this is danger, this is danger. That's all being turned off systematically. And it allows you to, we talk about present moment living. That is really what it means. It means in this very moment, I'm going to respond to what is in front of me appropriately with the now, not through looking through these lenses of I was traumatized, I was hurt, I was betrayed, I was all of these things, because then we can never fully step into the opportunities that life presents, because we're always approaching life through a filter that was designed and created 30 years ago. And it was designed from a place of trauma. Like, we don't want to carry that with us. But you've got to, if you want to step fully into the holistic and whole version of yourself, right? Have full access to your creativity, your power, your bravery, your love. Number one, right at the top is love, right? If you want to
love for self,
love for self, love for others, and underneath love, you've got love is a big umbrella. You've got compassion, you've got understanding, you've got forgiveness, you've got all those beautiful things. If you want to be able to access that, those triggers have to be switched off so that we can love ourselves, because now we've done the healing on our personal self and our physicality, and then of course we can share that love with others.
There's another exercise. It's basically a self-narration. The idea that the story you tell yourself can switch on and off how your genes are to express themselves as well. And this is really important because, if you tell yourself constantly, or even if you're telling yourself almost like unconsciously, if you're saying constantly to yourself that this is who I am, and I am this pattern, and you are affirming it, you basically trigger the placebo effect, and you start to, manifest it, or the nocebo effect, which is the opposite. And I think that the challenge is in all of this is environment. Like, have you guys come across the Minnesota twin study, where twins that are separated at birth are studied, and because they have the same DNA, because they have the same DNA, you would think the environment was just would influence them in a way, but the fact is that our genes and our DNA are really, really strong. And what's really important is that you work really hard to construct a narrative that's definitive, that has an architecture to it. This is who I am in my health, and you speak to that. This is who I am in my community, amongst my friends. You build that architecture of your identity in a way that you can feel like you're standing strong. Because if you're telling yourself that I'm unhealthy, then you are triggering those markers in your genes to reflect and turn off the design of your body to try to heal itself. And you are physically sort of, basically subjecting yourself to these markers. And what's fascinating, and I see this in my own life, that I know basically I'm a little bit crazy. And
Half.
Little bit.
exactly, right? And so my question is always, how do I regulate my crazy? And if I look at how I sort of design for not being crazy, by articulating a specific narrative for myself, designing things in my home, which I call my second brain, where if you put your keys in the same place every day, if you want to drink more water, you make water more prominent in key places in your home. What you're doing is you're creating an environment that is on a much deeper level, exposing you to the thing that's going to be good for you, versus you having to force yourself to try to think about these things.
If you are going to truly be the architect of your reality, you have to take accountability. That means you can't stop blaming your parents. You can't stop, you blame even the people, even the history of your people, right?
Yes.
We're aware that it has an influence.
Or other people.
100%.
Yeah, exactly.
But at some point, you have to say, okay, what's that saying? It's not what cards were dealt to you, but how you play the game. You had shit cards dealt to you. Fine, right? Maybe generational of bad decks thrown your way. Fine. But who are you living for, right? Because either you live your life as a victim, right? Or you take accountability. And when you can take accountability and go, right, no one is coming to rescue me. No one is coming to make me feel better. No one is coming to do anything, actually. It's up to me. That's the first step, because then it is a conscious choice, as you said so beautifully, to become the architect of your reality.
There's a book that I'm really interested in, history and anthropologists, and how particularly, how civilizations thrive. And so the British Empire hired anthropologists to go, how do we sustain our British Empire? And they hired a guy named Dudley Kidd to come to this part of the world, South Africa, to study what was happening inside of the kraal. And they call it the kraal effect. What they were doing was studying, and the idea, and the explicit idea was, let's elevate and strengthen what happens inside of the kraal in how we design colonialism, so that they will want to continue doing what's happening inside the kraal and not preoccupy themselves with what we are doing. And they said the manifesto to strengthen the empire was that you're going to have to strip various input in certain parts of the brain, and you're going to have to elevate other inputs in other parts of the brain. So what he proposed, Dudley Kidd proposed in this book, which basically is about socialism and extending the empire. And I'll share a link with you guys. It's actually on PDF. But this book has been taught at Harvard, and it's not some sort of conspiracy. It's just real science. And basically he says you're going to have to create 3 forms of education: miners, missionary, and traders education. And the explicit idea was to strip all science from education. And the idea was to elevate the arts and dance and music, because that's what was largely happening inside of the kraal. Now, this has epigenetic, intergenerational impact, because ultimately, if you develop a group of people and a society and intergeneration, you strip all science from the academia, you find now this is the reason why math scores are so low. It's not that they have a genetic deficiency, it's that the markers and the instinct for this specific activity has been turned off. Now, this is important. So yes, we do not want to point fingers, but the leaders and people in communities must rise up and go, this is how we've been engineered. And if we're going to move forward, we got to take accountability for this is who we are, and we need to engineer the way forward and figure out a way as a collective. And you wanted me to speak about the collective. Leadership plays a massive role in this.
But now the only problem is that leaders themselves are individuals. Have the leaders done this? You know what I mean? Are the leaders healthy enough, conscious enough to recognize this and to truly lead, if we look at that lack of knowledge and that lack of self-connection, right? Like the impact of that, and if people had this knowledge and the skill, because I do believe it's a skill, they would be able to self-regulate, they would be able to self-heal, you know, and it would just move us forward so much faster. But what are we being, you know, so if we had the British Empire being so conscious and planning their attack to the level that they did, why can we not plan our school system and plan how culture should work and society, so not culture, but how society should function? You know, why can't we not be as conscious, but in a really positive way?
The most successful empires have engineered this. They weren't just accidentally stumbling on great big societies, but they were responding. Most all empires were responding to some sort of extreme pressure. Think about how America was born. 1776, the idea was they were breaking away from extreme stress from another empire, right? South Africa's Rainbow Nation was birthed out of breaking away from an extreme stress. And as individuals, our ability to recognize and understand that unconsciously, deeply wired into our genome are extreme stresses. And with the same level of intensity, we have to bounce back from those stresses. You can't just kind of hope you're going to be fine. You really do have to design for it, and you've got to create a mindset and a system around you. And I think we're too casual about it.
There's actually a question for you, Sonia, from the audience. And the question it is, he says, I could not quite get what Sonia was talking about. No matter how much meditation you do, you can't shift your trauma or something like that. Can you please explain the phenomena in detail? Yeah.
Okay, so what happens is, I'm going to take you right from birth. All right, so prior to birth, you're already born with a predisposition of your ancestral memory. Okay, exactly what Tim was speaking about. So whether it's familial abuse that has happened through generations, or of course, racial abuse that has happened through generations. So before you're even born, you're predisposed and you have all of these, exactly like Tim said, these markers, right? That has kind of changed you. Now, as a child, you have to mature, and you have to mature physically, emotionally, mentally, okay? You then have the trauma. It might be a once-off trauma. It might be prolonged trauma, right, in the case of abuse. If you're unable to cope with it at that time, right, we disassociate from reality and we kind of put it in a box. And we go, that really hurts. That hurts on every single level. I'm unable to face it and cope with it. It's going in a box. And when the threat is over, right, because remember, fundamentally, Tim was saying earlier that we might be very conscious, evolved beings, but primarily we are 100% primal, and our being, our makeup is 100% survival based. So we are very prone, our bodies are very trigger happy to identifying threats. Okay, if not, we wouldn't be the dominant species on the planet that we are. So your body's going, right, this is a threat. It could be an emotional threat, a physical threat, a mental threat, whatever kind of threat it may be. It's been identified as a threat, unable to cope with it right now. So I'm going to shut it right down. Okay. And there's a whole bunch of stuff that happens physically. Your amygdala, which is, as your cognitive brain kind of shuts down and your amygdala kind of takes over, and that's kind of primal part of your brain. And it does that so that your organs, you know, the blood flow of your body actually starts functioning differently, so that you're primed to fight or flight. But what also happens is the emotional, and the most important part is the cognitive part of your brain shuts down. Because because you need those extra split seconds. Because if the thinking part of your brain is awake, what happens is it's like, then you start, well, should I do this? Or should I do that? Or maybe they didn't really mean to harm me, or too long, you're already dead. So the body actually shuts that part of your brain down, and it's just an instinctual response. Okay. Now imagine going through hundreds of those experiences where your body's doing that. Okay. So now over the lifetime, you've got all these little boxes of experiences that you had to put aside so that you could cope in that moment. Those get stored in your very cells. Okay. They are a part of your makeup, and they start, imagine them leaking out. They start influencing your mind, your belief systems, your behaviors, your actions, your viewpoints, everything. Okay. Now, the reason I say that you have to go back to a physical level is because that is where it is. It's like being in debt and trying to fix it by going fishing. It's just never going to work. Okay, you got to go to the bank and you got to give them money. That's the only way it's going to work. Problem is, our bodies are unable to tell the difference of past, present, or future. Okay, so a little experiment, everybody, right now. Think about a really, really happy thought. Memory. Think about a really happy memory. Think about winning. No, I'm going to worry about winning the lotto. Think about like just something super awesome. Okay, immediately you start getting an emotional response because your body's like, oh, something super awesome is happening. And then think about something really terrible and really sad. And immediately you can start feeling the lower emotional response because your body's like, oh, something super bad and terrible is happening. Okay. So really important fact, your body cannot tell the difference between past, present, and future. Now you won't need to heal all of these various things within you. So you have to go back to that place. Now your body thinks that it has to relive the trauma, relive the pain. So now all of those emotions are coming up, exactly. And that is where it stops us because we avoid it. We don't want to feel that pain. We didn't want to feel it back then. We certainly don't want to feel it now. And that's why it's so challenging to heal. So when I say it's a skill, because we have to practice it, and we start by the kind of lesser traumas, the lesser fears, pains, whatever they may be. But all you have to do, and it's so beautifully simple, you don't have to go to a shrink for 10 years. All you have to do is feel. That's it. You just have to feel what was unfelt so that that box can dissolve. And that's it. It's not easy because it hurts, and it hurts so much. But we've got to go back into it. And once we feel, and Tim, you use that word, digestion. We have to digest the stuff. We have to digest it. If we don't, it's like a lump inside of us and it will keep festering. So I hope that answered your question.
Do you think in these kind of like to be able to feel your own emotions, do you need to go to an expert or?
No, we know how to feel. You know how to feel,
of course.
You know how to feel joy. This is not like new, but we don't know how to feel pain. Because as a society, we are taught from birth to avoid pain.
To avoid pain.
Don't walk, buy a car. Don't wait 30 minutes to write a letter, type it out and email it. You know what I mean? Every single thing in our life is designed to avoid pain. Don't walk up the stairs, take an escalator. Don't go to gym, take a pill. Within families, no, we're not going to talk about that because that's uncomfortable. You know, we'll just push it under the rug. From the day we are born, we are taught to avoid pain.
Suppose you're very angry and you have this anger, so you're sitting with your anger. Is it important to know where this anger is coming from, or you just sit with it and feel it? Okay.
So anger is a symptom. So anger is always anger is a coping mechanism. Anger will always be masking a fear. And that fear could take many different things. Yeah. Anger is the symptom. And if you stay in anger, you're going to stay in victimhood. Well, that person did that to me. You know, what an arsehole. Da, 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 da. How is that moving you forward? They may have done that to you. Absolutely. But even if they say, I'm sorry, that it's still living inside of you. That anger is still living inside of you. But remember, the anger is a symptom. You have to go past the anger. And that's where the bravery comes in. Because we don't want to admit that we're afraid. We don't want to admit that we need, vulnerability, huge. Like, who on this planet wants, because we view it as weakness. Western mindset. You know, you can't ever show weakness. And what do we categorize as weakness? Fear, rejection, neediness. I mean, the list is huge, right? But we are human. We have these things inside of us. We have these needs. And if you're brave enough to get below the anger, below all of that surface level symptom, then we get to the true feelings. And those true feelings are valid because they exist. They did exist. They still exist. And until we digest them, until we feel them, they're going to keep manifesting.
That's my big takeaway is that you got to design for your healing. You got to design, put your designer hat on, take these tools, the TS, what is it? TRE. All of these tools, you got to design them into your life. You got to design. So have fun becoming a designer after this conversation.
Wow. Great. Thank you.
When you said hope, and I just say one last thing. Hope is not a strategy. Remember that.
Hope is not a strategy.
Okay. Yeah.
Take accountability, take action, take responsibility.
And design your life. Yeah. Your healing. Yeah. Great. So much. Thanks everyone, those who are watching, and thanks to the awesome panelists.